I'll be reading from 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 3 through 6. Know this, first of all, that in the last days mockers will come with their mocking, following after their lusts, and saying, where is the promise of his coming? For ever since the fathers fell asleep, all continues just as it was from the beginning of creation. For when they maintain this, it escapes their notice that by the word of God the heavens existed long ago, and the earth was formed out of water and by water, through which the world at that time was destroyed, being flooded with water.
We continue our series this evening on science and the Bible. You know, there are three major physical events in the history of our world. First is most certainly the creation of the universe and all things in those 6 days by God. The second is the global flood of Noah that God brought upon this earth because of the sins of mankind. And the last has not happened as of yet, but most certainly will. And that is the destruction of the whole creation in fervent heat at the end of time. When we look at these three things, the flood is probably the most controversial of the three. You know, to the unbeliever, creation is not really a problem because they ultimately do not believe in God. They don't believe in the Bible. They don't believe in His creating of all things in 6 days. And as far as they view it, it's a point of faith in the unseen. Just as the evolutionary teachings on origins is a matter of faith in the unseen. Proving such things empirically is difficult, if not impossible. And unbelievers do not spend much time refuting the 6 days of creations. Most of our battles over the 6 days of creation tend to be with theistic evolutionists, people that want the Bible and science to go together. But most atheists, most unbelievers simply speak of it in jest. They joke about it. And for the same reasons, unbelievers do not really take much time to refute or to argue or to really do much of anything in regard to the final destruction of all things at the end of time. There is, however, mountains of data to support the reality of a global flood. There is far more opposition to the flood from science than the other things that we have mentioned. Most of the evidence in regard to the flood is often ignored. It is sometimes perverted in some manner to fit uniformitarian and evolutionary models or mindsets that are prevalent in science today. We're going to spend a few weeks studying the flood on Sunday nights. Next week we will study the ark. And exactly how big was that ark? Could it have held all those animals? Could it have stayed afloat for over a year? Those things are all important questions and things that we will examine next week as we think about what Noah built. In 2 weeks, we will examine the flood itself as the Bible records it and follow the timetable that the Bible shows us of that event. Following that lesson, we will consider the effects of the flood that are still visible to this very day on our planet. Tonight, I want us to consider the world that existed before the flood. You know, the makeup of this antediluvian world, and that antediluvian, that's one of those fancy preacher words. I think preachers just make up words sometimes, but it's a fancy preacher word for before the flood. The antediluvian world quite possibly contributed to the flood in more ways than just providing the sinful people that would ultimately bring about that judgment. And of course, we understand that the flood was not a surprise to God. You know, God didn't create man and then suddenly shocked at the choices that man would make if given the ability to choose. God knew man was going to choose to sin. God knew that because He chose Jesus and the plan to send Him to this earth before the very foundation of this world. He knew it. It wasn't a surprise. And so it's quite possible as we think about these things, we can look at them two ways. As we look at the flood, there could be it could be a miraculous event, but it's also quite possible as we look at some evidences that the flood is a natural event that was set in place by God from the creation, a creation in which He understood and knew that 1,656 years after that creation week, He would destroy mankind, save 8 souls. As we consider this antediluvian world, there is very little history about that world. We have seen some codexes, some indexes of ancient libraries, and there seems to have been a time when there was a great deal of history maybe about this time before the flood. In one particular index, there is 20 volumes of history from before the flood. I'd love to see what's in those volumes. We don't have the books or the scrolls or tablets, but instead we just have the listing of those things. We see the stories of the first family, and we see the story of the last family, and basically genealogies fill in the middle. And of that 1,656 years, we have very little to almost nothing of the history that took place during that time. Peter spoke of this world, when he said in 2 Peter chapter 3 and verse 6, the world at that time was destroyed, being flooded by water. So we think about the world that was, the world that was destroyed. The flood brought about an end to a perfect and a pristine world, a world that God looked at and said, it is very good, and brought to the fruition the full consequences of the sins that Adam and Eve committed there in the Garden of Eden as they ate of that fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. As they ate of that, God pronounced certain consequences upon mankind. The ground would be cursed. It would be changed forever. Man would have to toil and sweat for food all the days of his life. Man would have to deal with thorns and thistles. And while certainly these consequences came to a certain, in certain aspects before the flood would certainly bring them to their full place, as the world would change dramatically because of that event. Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 7. We see there in that listing of great faithful people, the writer of Hebrews talk about Noah. And it says, by faith Noah, being warned by God about things not yet seen, in reverence prepared an ark for the salvation of his household. Notice that the writer of Hebrews says that he was operating off of things not yet seen. We go back to verse 1 of Hebrews chapter 11, and we get that that's the very definition, isn't it, of faith? Those things not seen. And so he's told things by God. Things are going to happen that Noah has never seen. And he's going to have to just trust that God is going to do exactly what He says. And He does. There are unique aspects of the world before the flood that seem maybe relate to Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 7 and the statement made to Noah about things not seen. According to Genesis chapter 2 and verses 5 and 6, it seems that it did not rain before the flood, that a mist rose up and watered the ground. And so that statement of things not seen may be the rain itself. You're going to see something you haven't seen, Noah, if that is the case. If that mist from the ground is the only manner in which God chose to water the world before the flood. Certainly, there is no doubt, and would be the case today, that Noah had never seen destruction in a flood on this scale. So he's going to see something that no person, save those 8 people, saw and survived. And so, there are things, either one of those could be considered, and there could be other things that we don't even think about or consider as we look at that. As we consider what we know about this time, we also see that there is a longevity of mankind that far exceeds the longevity of man today. In fact, it vastly exceeds it by some 9 to 10 times. And this is probably the case for the animals as well, and which will relate to our later discussions as we think about dinosaurs and things of that nature. So as we think about the Bible, does it describe anything that might contribute to conditions that would make these things a reality, would make these things a possibility? And I believe that it does provide some possible explanations. First thing we see is the idea of a vapor canopy. In day 2 of the creation, it says, "Then God said, let there be an expanse." Your Bible may say firmament. But let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters. And God made the expanse and separated the waters which were below the expanse from the waters which were above the expanse, and it was so. The waters below the expanse are the waters that are on the earth. At this time, there's no land yet. It's just water. And so there's water upon the earth. Excuse me. We have the expanse, and that is the sky. That is the air in which the birds fly in. In fact, verse 20 of chapter 1 of Genesis tells us that the birds flew in the expanse. So we have a definition of that area. And then there is waters above the expanse. And certainly any look at that would be atmospheric as we would think about it. And so we think about the waters above. And we go forward to the flood. And we see that it rains for 40 days. Do you know how long it would take to rain every bit of moisture out of our atmosphere today? A matter of minutes. We don't have 40 days of rain in our atmosphere. We just don't. And so we look at that and we consider maybe that water above was much more than it is now. When we think about the vapor canopy theory, and it is a theory because we can't reproduce it and we don't see it and we didn't see it, we didn't witness it. But this water above the expanse consisted of much more water vapor in the atmosphere before the flood than after, and even to this day. There were 40 days of rain that fell in that antediluvian world from that atmosphere, and these are the waters above the expanse. The windows of heaven opened, and that rain fell. What effects would such a dense water-saturated atmosphere have? I think that's a question we should ask and we should think about and consider. What would it have upon the earth, and what would it have upon those living on the earth? If we took that the moisture that it would take to rain for 40 days as our guide, we can determine some of the effects, and some scientists out there have determined the effects that would have upon our planet. There would be, first of all, a constant temperate climate across the entire planet. Subtropical to tropical climate, somewhere in the 75-degree range. I could stand 75 degrees every day. How about y'all? Such a condition would eliminate also high winds and atmospheric disturbances. Let me give you what evolutionists say. As they talk about evidences that they think they're talking about the evolutionary timetable. But here one evolutionist said, the warm, equable climate, characteristic of the entire Cretaceous, prevailed almost over the whole world. Did you catch that? That's an evolutionist talking. He's not talking about the Bible. He's not talking about the vapor canopy. He says it prevailed almost over most of the world throughout the Jurassic, with possible localized exceptions. This universal tropicality is difficult to explain. And I would have to agree with him. It is difficult to explain by the methods that he would try to explain it. Another one Dr. Arkell, also an evolutionist, summarized the Jurassic era as this: a fairly rich flora of temperate facies flourished within or near both the Arctic and Antarctic circles in East Greenland and Gremlin. On Axel Heiberg Island, he states, the forests are mummified, the wood is dry and somewhat compressed, but otherwise unchanged, with many trees reaching more than 100 feet in height. On Axelberg Island, it lies 680 miles from the North Pole. Palm trees have been found buried in ice, and petrified trees in Antarctica. Massive coal reserves indicative of vast amounts of vegetation have been found in these same Arctic areas. Flash frozen mammoths and elephants in Siberia have been found with flowers in their teeth. Creation scientists Wickham and Morris have suggested this. They say the most immediate and obvious of these effects would be to cause a uniformly warm, temperate climate around the earth. Such water vapor as is present in the atmosphere today has this specific effect of regulating the Earth's temperature. The inferred antediluvian vapor envelope would have produced the result in much greater degree, with a larger percentage of the sun's incoming radiant energy being absorbed, retained, and uniformly distributed over the earth than at present, both seasonally and latitudinally. The constant battle of fronts would almost be absent, so that the antediluvian climates were not only warm, but were also without violent windstorms. Such an environment would have slight air currents, but no extreme weather such as we experience to this day. Storms, I hear people, I was in a town where 600 homes were destroyed in a 1,000-year flood. And within a year, a little small town just outside of that same town was completely obliterated from the map by an F4 tornado. And I heard that question, why does God let storms kill people? Let floods do what they do? And I think as we think about this in this particular way, storms and bad weather are a product of the flood. And the flood is a product of sin. God's creation from the beginning, if this is the case, was not a creation that had such things. It wasn't from God. But it was a destruction of that creation that He had made. We also, as we think about this temperate climate, this tropical climate throughout, certainly we make a world that's tailor-made for dinosaurs, don't we? Cold-blooded, large animals need warm temperatures to be active. Some Christians have denied dinosaurs. I've heard Christians say there's no such thing as dinosaurs. Folks, don't do that. There were dinosaurs. I've seen the actual prints in the ground. I've stood at them in the Rocky Mountains and seen them, watched them, saw how they go up the side of a hill. Dinosaurs are real. Don't deny those kind of things. And they lived in this world, and it would have been a world that was perfect for them. It takes an extraordinary amount of vegetation as well. And certainly this world was a world filled with vegetation. An 8 to 10 ton elephant today eats 400 pounds of food a day to live. Can you imagine what a 40 to 50 ton Argentinosaurus ate a day? Can you imagine the amount of vegetation that animal had to eat in order to live? It was a world that made that possible. We'll talk more about that in just a moment. We also see that it would have been a world of increased air pressure. Hyperbaric chambers today have been used to accelerate healing in burn victims and other injuries. People have been able to do away with glasses because of these chambers. Higher pressure and greater percentage of oxygen than our normal atmosphere exist in these chambers, and they have certain medicinal value. Those who use such chambers, though, today have a problem. They have a problem of compression and decompression. Divers have that same problem, right? They go deep down in the ocean. They are in a compressed environment as far as the air, and then when they come back, they have to decompress. But you know, there's no such problems of compression and decompression in organisms that are born into that environment. They have taken hyperbaric chambers and used them and had animals born into them. Copperheads, for one example, were born into them. And interestingly enough, in that environment, being born into that environment, their venom's chemical makeup changes to where it's not poisonous anymore. Once again, as we think back to God's creation and how much men's sins may have changed that which God created. Noah and his family were born into such a pressure, if the vapor canopy theory is correct, and had 40 days of decompression. Those 40 days of rain. As the atmosphere thinned, as that moisture poured to the earth, they went through a decompression from that increased air pressure that they were born into. It is believed that a canopy capable of pouring 40 days of rain upon the earth would have resulted in about a 2 to 2.5 times the air pressure that we experience today. And the percentage of oxygen would also be increased with such an atmosphere. Again, an evolutionary scientist of the U.S. Geological Survey measured oxygen in microscopic bubbles trapped in amber and fossilized tree resin. And he found the amount of oxygen dropped from 35% 2 million years before the end of the Cretaceous period to the 21% that we have today. So even the evolutionary scientist accepts and acknowledges that sometime in the past there was a higher oxygen percentage in our atmosphere than we experience today. Because of this, people in the antediluvian world would have had accelerated healing and health, possibly leading to extremely long lifespans, those extremely long lifespans that we see in Genesis chapters 1 through 7. When we look at those lifespans, the average lifespan, if we exclude Enoch, he's kind of the outlier there because he didn't die, he was taken. But if we exclude Enoch from those figures, the average lifespan was 908 years. Methuselah is the top of the list, isn't he, as far as what we have recorded, at 969 years. Methuselah, by the way, will die in the year of the flood. And there was only 2 months for him to die before the flood came. So whether he died before the flood or in the flood, we're not sure, but he did die the year of the flood. Some Christians have tried to change these ages from years to months. And you know, they try to get these ages down to some kind of a thinking that they can put their heads around. But the problem with that, you have Enoch having his son at 5 years old. And I don't think that's probably the case. Babylonian clay tablets spoke of kings before the flood that lived 20,000 years each. Certainly it's an exaggeration of these extremely long ages, but indicative of the historical understanding by ancient cultures of the long lives of those that lived before the flood. And we can see that these patriarchs did not only live very long, but were healthy and strong for hundreds of years. Noah builds an ark, that enormous boat, sometime after he's 500 years old. The flood begins in his 600th year. And he entered that ark in that second month of that 600th year, but he built that ark somewhere between 500 and 600 years old. Something about the flood also brought on a rapid decrease in lifespans following the flood. If you look at a graph of the ages before and the ages after the flood, it just goes like this. It just drops. It plummets, and there has to be an explanation for that. You know, the effects of the long life, though, seem to be carried on in those that were born in that environment. Noah still lived to be very old. Shem, he lived for many generations after the flood. In fact, as we think about that generation, and those that lived through the flood and on the other side of the flood, we see that from Shem to Abraham there are 9 generations. Only 2 of those 9 generations outlived Shem. And the first one was Eber, and he lived to be 464 years old, and he was the great-great-grandson of Shem. And the other person to outlive Shem in those 9 generations was Abraham. And he was 7 times great-grandson of Shem. Shem saw great-great-great-grandchildren die of old age as he continued to live. In fact, Shem would not die until Isaac's teenage years. He is still around. Isaac, Abraham still had someone they could have talked to that rode on that ark. And that's amazing to think about. And yet by the time we get to Abraham, lifespans have drastically decreased. The times of reproduction have decreased. Noah had his sons at 500, and it was a big thing for Abraham to have a son at 90, right? Things have changed in the world in those 400 years. We also come to understand as they do these experiments that fermentation was not something that probably could happen in that kind of environment. I'm not going to get into the technical aspects. That's not our purpose tonight. But increased air pressure and increased oxygen levels create a different process than we currently see today. And it might very well explain some things about Noah after the flood, right? When he began to drink out of his vineyard and drank himself until he was drunk, that may not have been possible before the flood, if these things are true. We also see that these same changes would also apply to bacteria and other microorganisms. They would have not been able to flourish in such an environment. There's evidence that some bacteria would not have even been harmful in this environment. And let's go back to the dinosaurs again. And we're going to talk about them in detail in a few weeks. But I want us to come back at this particular point and think about it for a moment. People are living 902 years on average that we have recorded. There's no reason not to believe that animals are not living much longer lifespans as well. And one thing about reptiles is as long as they live, they continue to grow. And they get bigger and bigger. Large dinosaurs would have flourished with the increased air pressure and oxygen. Because there is such a thing as diffusion, oxygen diffusion into our bodies. And the level of oxygen diffusion in an animal determines its size. The distribution of oxygen throughout the body is increased with pressure. This pressure would have brought about gigantism. And we read about the Nephilim, right? The giants that existed before the flood in such an atmosphere. The largest of the dinosaurs, and there's just no way around this, the largest of the dinosaurs that we understand and we have found would have required this atmosphere to live. Just from a standpoint of being able to have enough oxygen to survive. After the flood, these human lifespans decreased, and we can also come to the understanding that the same thing happened probably with animals. Dinosaurs would have lived shorter lives and therefore would have gotten smaller. Some may have just gotten smaller, and maybe all there is to it. Some flying reptiles, such as the pterodons, could not fly in our much thinner atmosphere, but would have been able to fly in a thick atmosphere, such as the one before the flood. Many dinosaurs simply would not have been able to thrive in an environment that came about as a result of the flood. Weather extremes, cold weather of a large, cold-blooded animal, making it unable to be active when it needs so much food to eat, would have made it very difficult for them to live. Not as much vegetation. The earth was scoured clean of all that vast vegetation that would have been there before. And now they are having to live on much less. And there's one thing that we need to never forget as well. In chapter 9 and verse 3, for the first time, man is commanded to eat what? Eat meat. A lot of meat on a dinosaur, probably. I don't know if it was good, if it tasted like chicken or what. But certainly they would have been animals that may have been victims of hunting. These thoughts are much easier to accept than some of the flights of fancy that evolutionists have come up with for the extinction of many of the dinosaurs. There's a thick book on a theory called the Zonk Theory. Now, I'm telling you what, you've got to really sit around and twiddle your thumbs and think hard to come up with things like the Zonk Theory. That an asteroid came and burst in our atmosphere and softball-sized chunks clunked the dinosaurs on the head and killed most of them. That's a hard one to... I'm going to have to sit around and think about that one for a while. They write large books on things like that. It's much easier to believe that their environment changed and they simply couldn't thrive. We also see that in this world, I've got to hurry. Doug, I preached short this morning so I could preach an hour or two tonight. Is reduced solar radiation. And this may also contribute to the lifespans, as this thicker atmosphere would have filtered most of the solar radiation. Thinner atmosphere after the flood allowed more of this radiation through. When we think about the forbidding of marriage, I can't imagine anybody wanting to marry my sisters, and I certainly don't want to marry them, right? Isn't that how most of brothers feel? But yet, that was not forbidden early on. We see Abraham married to his half-sister. That was not something that was forbidden. And yet it's not going to be forbidden until the law of Moses 700 years after the flood. And it could be, the reason why we don't do that, it's a genetic issue. About locking in genetic problems. And some genetic problems are a result of radiation, even solar radiation. And that may have compounded over the years until God said, okay, that's got to stop. Because God, understanding that better than anyone, knew that now that would be a problem. The process of solar high-energy neutrons colliding with nitrogen nuclei, that is the process by which we have carbon-14. And it would be stopped or dramatically slowed due to the inability of those neutrons to penetrate the vapor barrier, this thicker atmosphere. And therefore, radiocarbon dating techniques assume that the amount, we talked about this a little bit last week, they assume a uniformitarian idea that things have always gone the same way that as they are now. And yet that would be a problem when you think about this. Because the radiocarbon entering the atmosphere has not been constant if this is the case. And a water vapor canopy would make any accurate radiocarbon dating of rocks or fossils that existed before the flood, it would make it impossible to get an accurate date. I would also like for us to quickly consider the intelligence of the people before the flood. When we think about how long it was between creation and the flood, we can add it up, and it's 1,656 years, according to the genealogies. Tell me what technological advances our world today has come up with since 355 A.D. Think about that. And we had centuries of the Dark Ages, where it's believed that science was set back for centuries as a result of people's closed-mindedness towards science. And yet, those people lived for that kind of period of time. Long life as well, as we think about how long that they lived. Long life had continued learning opportunities. What if Einstein was still alive? So much of what he understood, so much of his thought processes that were going on in his mind were lost when he died. We can read his papers and you can look at his theories, but yet the mind that did that's gone. What if he was still alive? What if he had another 800 years to think on the things that he sat around and thought about? How much smarter would he have gotten? How much more could he have known and come to understand? We have about 70 years to learn and apply the knowledge that we have. They had hundreds of years to learn and apply knowledge. People had 8 to 9 times as much as we do. When we look at Cain's descendants in Genesis chapter 4 and verses 17 through 22, we see that Cain, after he killed his brother, went and he built a city. He's not a brainless caveman. In fact, when you look into that, you'll find out that that is really the falsehoods that are out there. Cavemen and Cro-Magnon men are an invention of evolutionary minds. But we also see that bronze and iron were worked. The age of iron, as history will tell you, began around 1200 BC. The flood took place in 2485 BC. So over 700 years earlier, Cain's descendant, Tubal-Cain, was already working iron and bronze. One of Cain's descendants named Jubal also invented and made and played musical instruments. Jabal, Jubal's brother, developed the nomadic lifestyle. So we see that these people, as we see them described in Cain's genealogy, they were intelligent. They were inventive. They were smart. There is a clear regression of technology in the ancient world in the centuries following the flood. The world before the flood appears to have been quite advanced, and yet most of that would have been lost in the world that was destroyed. Let me explain that statement to you. Imagine tonight that we find out that this world's going to be completely destroyed by some particular means. There's only 8 in this room that are going to survive it. How many physicists do we have in here? What's going to be lost that's in our world today when only 8 people get through? A lot's going to be lost, isn't it? A lot of things we're not going to be able to replicate. A lot of things we're not going to be able to do afterwards because we don't understand how to do it, how to make it. So a lot will be lost. And that same exact thing should be considered when we think about the 8 people that came through the flood. And when we think about what would come through, what would be the skill set or the knowledge base that would come through the flood? Well, it would be a knowledge base of engineering. Noah built a boat that was enormous. A boat that would have had to have an engineering thought process into it. Certainly God preserved that boat. But it doesn't take away from what Noah may have brought to bear on it in knowledge. And so we see that come through. And what we look at what took place in the world immediately after the flood, things that were being done. Genesis chapter 11, they're building a tower to heaven, right? It's an engineering feat. In that same time frame, in that 400 years between Abraham and the flood, the Egyptians build the pyramids, moving stones that we still don't really know how they moved the stones that they put on those pyramids, how they got them so high. Still no understanding of that. The Egyptians had mummification processes that we still don't understand, that people are still trying to figure out how to replicate it. They had an advanced understanding of astronomy that was lost and then regained. There was a lot of knowledge that came through the flood, and yet it then regressed, and we see it in the ancient world that existed after the flood. Last of all, we ask the question of how many people. When we think about the flood, I think there's almost a thought process. I know when I was a kid, I thought of, Noah lived in a town. And, or a city, and the people were there, and God destroyed them all. And pretty much everybody died in the flood, knew Noah. Probably wasn't the case. That's a child's way of thinking. The fact that these people are childbearing for hundreds of years. Our childbearing years are maybe 30, 40. But they are bearing children for hundreds of years in their lifespans. And, it leads us to believe that there was probably a large number of people during this time. Abraham, 452 years after the flood, was 100 years old, and it was an amazing thing that he had children. And Sarah was 90. And yet those ages are far surpassed by men such as Noah who had his 3 sons after 500 years. Dr. Henry Morris, in his groundbreaking book, The Genesis Flood, figures that a conservative figure, a figure of 0.5% of growth. Currently, we're about 4% of growth per year. 0.5% of growth would put over 1 billion people on the earth at the time of the flood. Genesis chapter 6 and verse 11 says that, talking about that world, says the earth was filled with violence. Not just in a location, not just a small group of people, but it was filled throughout. You know, Adam and Eve were told to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. That was God's expectation for them. By the way, it's the same expectation, excuse me, same expectation that we see God have of Noah. When him and his family came off the ark, God told him the same thing: be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And then we roll over to Genesis chapter 11. And they're not doing it, are they? They're not filling the earth. They're staying together in this tight little group. They're building a city. They're building a tower. They're not doing what God said. And so what does God do? He gets what He wants. God wanted the earth filled. He didn't want them to live in one city. So He confused their languages and spread them over the entire earth, so that they would then do exactly what He had commanded to be done, to fill the earth. Well, if we see that in the beginning, and certainly if God said it there and He expected it to be done there, He expected it to be done with Noah, we can believe that they filled the earth, that they were spread over the entire planet, and that they were destroyed on that global scale. I hope that some of these things, I know for some, when you're dealing, it's sort of like me doing ones where I talk a lot of history. Some people love history, some people hate history. Some people love science, some people don't. Some of these things are things we don't often think about, but yet they are things that are relevant. Relevant as we talk about what is going on in science, what is going on in regard to our Christian faith, and how we are to deal with it, and how we are to view it. And I think it's important. And certainly, this is not an all, it's not everything that we can cover, but all that our time will allow. I think one thing we have to always remember, and we have to always think, is really it's Peter's point. When Peter's talking about the world that was destroyed, his point was there were people saying Christ is not going to come back. Everything's just continued to go as it's always gone, and it's just going to continue to go that way. Peter says, you're not thinking about what God has done before. Oh yeah, they thought it was all going to just keep on going the way it had always been going, and then suddenly they were done. God's judgment came, and only those that did what God said were on the ark. For us, we need to always remember that this life is not going to continue on and on and on and on. There's going to come a moment where God's judgment comes down. Now, He'll never flood this earth with water again. We can be certain of that. God has made that promise, and I believe that promise to be true. But He will destroy it with fire. And that judgment is coming. And the key thing for each and every one of us is to be ready. To make certain that we are on that ark when that door is shut and no one else gets in. If you're not there this evening, if you're not in the Lord's church, if you're not in that which is preserving those who will be saved from that judgment day, you need to get inside. Because there's a day coming when He will shut the door and no one else will get in. And all else will be destroyed. We can help you be there this evening. We hope that you will let us as we stand.